Guten Abend.
Guten Abend.
David Toop. Pleasure to have you here on our channel, on my channel. Stunty co-host for obvious reasons in this interview. David, how are you? Where are you?
I'm very good, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm in London, where I live, North London, and looking forward to talking about this huge and wonderful box set.
Yes. Right away. We're talking today, about this giant of a box set. Anybody who thinks this is the box set, no, it's not. It's only part one. Part two has the same magnitude, the same size. We're talking two amazing books. We're talking 16 albums in this booklight, beautiful showcase, slipcase. Amazing. I already did my video about it, and as everybody knows by now, I'm totally impressed also with those two hardcover books, each book, one book in each box set. And yeah, next to your career, next to the timeline, how did this came to be, David?
It's an interesting story. I was contacted some years ago by Frank of Vinyl on Demand.
Oh.
And I think what had happened was that he had acquired an archive, or at least a collection, of somebody in Germany. And also, I think what had happened was that there were one or two Quartz Molotov cassettes in that archive.
Mm.
And that made him think, this is a possible project. So he contacted me and I said, it's absolutely not possible. Even I don't own a copy of one of these cassettes. So I was one of the two people, along with Paul Burwell, who started this label. And I don't have any copies. And I don't remember much about the other releases. And, you know, it just seemed not feasible to put something together. And Frank was very determined, very persuasive. And he continued to say, I'm sure this is possible. I'm sure we can find remaining copies. And he persisted and persisted. And eventually, between the two of us, we managed to make some sort of coherent picture of the label.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ways in which he did that,
David, quickly, maybe we should just tell who Frank is a little bit and what he's doing, because to give more context about why it was important for him to do this box sets with you.
Yes, you're right. Frank Meyer, who runs this extraordinary label, Vinyl on Demand, which a lot of it is repackaging of archive materials of various kinds. Incredible productions, beautiful productions. The one I have is Los Angeles Free Music Society, who are old friends. I mean, going back again to the 70s. Tom
is here in the comments.
Fantastic. Hi, Tom. Tom and I have been friends since the 1970s, and there's always been a closeness between us. And in fact, I've played with the Extended Organ, Paul McCarthy's group, which includes many members of the LAFMS, on a number of occasions. And, you know, we're still in touch and close. So that box set I thought was amazing.
Yeah.
So I knew that Frank did a good job. I just didn't believe that it could be done with this label.
And Frank, what he does also is that he's doing exactly what you say. But what's the most amazing is the amount of projects he's had over the time. It's not that he does 1 or 2 or 3 a year. There's hundreds of the most comprehensive box sets of some of the most obscure musicians. It is almost autistic in a way.
We're talking Soviet France, CAM organization, necrophile label. He started with Die tödliche Doris, which was a very obscure German band. I think he's above 100 box sets in the last 1.5 decades. It's impressive. Yeah.
To think that the one he dedicated to you and this project is probably the most impressive one yet is amazing.
Well, it surprises me when I see what he's releasing, because this box set nearly killed me working on it, so but he's okay. I've been doing a lot of other work as well, but to the attention to detail is extraordinary.
What was your concrete? What was your part? What did you actually do when it comes to this box set?
Apart from everything.
I'm one of the last surviving people in this group of musicians. Paul Burwell died in 2007, and some of the other people died various times, and that meant that a lot of the work of assembly, bringing together many of the archive materials that are in the books, writing the essay for the book, editing the materials, editing the music, because everything was on C90 cassettes. So, and also the quality was very poor on some of them. On some of them, so bad that we couldn't use it. There was almost nothing there. So, and some of them were in a very confused state, like the recordings with Bob Cobbing. There were 2 versions, and they're at different speeds for some reason, but half of one and half of the other, and then a crossover which showed that they're at different speeds. So I had to put both versions into Logic, adjust the speed, synchronize them so that they matched, and segue them so that it made a continuous recording. So there were times when I just said to Frank, I just don't know what's going on. 16 LPs. And I was losing track, and he was incredibly patient, and encouraging, and kept me from losing my mind, I would say.
How many years between when you actually started working on it and now?
It's hard to say. Most of the work, I would say, was done last year, early part of last year, and the end of the year before that. So the conversations went on for a number of years, but the actual work itself was quite an intense period. Because it was so complex. It's funny, when you see the box, it's distilled into a kind of simplicity.
Yeah.
And particularly because of the design, this lovely design gives it a homogeneity. But actually, when you begin, it's just fragments. Everything is fragments. Everything is physically distributed. So the materials for the books, for example, a lot of that comes from either my archive or Paul's archive. So my archive is not, it's in a good state, but it's not in a rational state, if you know what I mean. I can't just go to the letter K and find everything there that's under K. It's just I have to look through many, many files and box folders. And so, to bring all this material together was really quite something. And I think of sometimes I sort of poor Brian Wilson when he was making Smile, and it became so complex, and so overwhelming that he just kind of lost it, and it didn't come out. And I felt that at some points that I just don't know where I am.
Yeah.
But Frank kept me on the track, and so we made it.
This Quartz Militant labels, they are always considered as a myth of a label because those audio cassettes are so rare. And you mentioned at the beginning that you yourself even don't have many of them. But where did you get them? Who had them? Because if Frank Bull or Frank Meyer doesn't have them, that really means something, because he is a serious collector of this kind of music. Where did you get the source material?
Yeah. Here's a rarity.
Yeah, can say
a Quartz Militant cassette.
Yeah.
And this is the only one I have. And the only reason I have this is because I have a friend, John Kiefer, who used in the 1970s to work in a bookshop in Brighton called Public House Bookshop. And that's where we recorded one side of this cassette. So he'd kept this from that being released.
Yeah.
Because they sold it in the bookshop. And very kindly, a few years ago, he actually gave this to me. So that's the only reason I have this. But I thought the cause was hopeless, and we tried various people, and nobody seemed to have any. We went to Frank Perry, we went to Evan Parker, we went through Hugh Davis's archive, or the archivist who looks after Hugh Davis's archive went through everything. But then Frank bought Paul Burwell's archive.
Okay.
And Paul had some copies, not all. So there are still two missing cassettes. One was a Hugh Davis solo, and I can't even remember what the other one was. And we couldn't find those.
That brings a couple of questions actually, but back then, like throughout my years, I've met musicians who have told me about this label and these cassettes, older gentlemen most of the time, but so they got in contact with these records long before this project of this box set. So how were these distributed back then, and how many were done approximately of each, and etc.?
I should give you some background. Paul and I had been working together since around Christmas 1969.
You were
and we had
you were still teens almost.
No, we were both 20.
Okay.
That in 1969 Christmas, we were both 20 years old, and we formed a duo called Rain in the Face, which performed quite regularly in the improvised music scene. And we also worked with the sound poet Bob Cobbing and a number of other people, Carlisle Reedy, Maury Yates, various artists. But that duo lasted until 1975, which was when I made my record for Brian Eno's Obscure label, New and Rediscovered Musical Instruments. Thank you. And
of course you have it. It's an original, right?
I think so.
Yes, well, there are different originals, but that's a different story. So we sort of briefly split up at that time, and then we started playing together again under our own names. We stopped this name Rain in the Face, and the thing is, we had no money at all. We really had no money. We were living in more or less poverty. And it was extremely difficult to get a recording made of what we were doing. And by 1977, this was, just to tell you a quick story, which I've told many times before, but we got to know Henry Cowell, Fred Frith, and Chris Cutler. in the early part of the 1970s, and they were at that time in touch with the new Virgin Records. And Chris Cutler said, you should go to Simon Draper, who is the A&R at Virgin Records, and play him a tape of what you're doing. And we had a BBC tape recording. I took it and he listened to it for a bit, obviously not enjoying it. And then he said, let me play you something. And he played me a record which I didn't enjoy very much, which was Tubular Bells by Mike Oldfield. And he said, this is coming out soon. And of course, we all know what happened with that. You know, it was hugely successful and established the label. But, you know, we couldn't convince anybody to release a record. And also, I think we had got interested in the idea of doing these very informal, releasing very informal things, not studio things, not even rehearsal things, but just, you know, something we recorded outdoors or very intimate sort of playing for ourselves. And that's why we started the label. And we started it in 1977. And the way we were able to start it was because Paul went to the Royal College of Art to do a master's. Mm-hmm. And as was the case when he'd been a student at Ealing College of Art, the first thing he did was to look at the resources that were available. So at Ealing, he'd found he could print things. So we made, from 1971 onwards, we made books, which are now collected together in the box set. At the Royal College of Art, he realized they had a Revox tape recorder. And so, okay, that's what we'll do. We'll copy from cassettes onto the Revox, and then we'll use that as a master. I don't know why we had this stupid idea. We were dazzled by this Revox tape recorder. So everything was hand done. You know, the tapes were recorded onto Revox from cassette, then recorded back onto cassettes, one by one. And it took forever, and particularly since the Royal College of Art was in South Kensington, which was the opposite end of London to where I lived. So doing these things, I mean, it would have been easier to work in a factory and save money to put a record out, honestly. And of course, the quality doing it that way was very poor, and it exhausted us.
This medium, this audio cassette medium, did you consider it as the perfect medium for the kind of music you were creating, or was it just what was at hand?
I think both, Michael, actually. I think in one way it suited this idea of making informal recordings. Yeah. Where it didn't matter if there was a noise going on in the background. It didn't matter that they were lo-fi recordings. It didn't matter that they weren't polished professional performances. It was like having a notebook. You know, it was like a kind of a diary in a way for us. And in that sense, I think cassettes were perfect. I liked cassettes. I've always liked cassettes. And I always made mixtapes, you know, with cassettes of all the music I liked, and I always made my own covers, so that it fitted in with that particular aesthetic, that idea of doing everything yourself. And of course, we'd learned from making the books in the early 70s. You know, this cottage industry, I suppose you could say it was, but you know, it suited the politics of what we were doing, the politics of the time. And it was cheap. And everybody had a cassette player back then.
And so how were they distributed eventually?
Well, again, this goes back to the books and our involvement with Bob Cobbing. Bob Cobbing had a publishing I wouldn't say a company. He published under the name of Writers Forum, and he'd been doing that for years and years and years. And he was an inspiration to us because, if Bob wanted to make a book on Christmas Day, he would do it. He had a big photocopier in his flat where he lived, and he'd make a book. And at that time, it was the time for art centers. So in many cities and even towns you went to in the UK and in Europe as well, you would find an art center, a place where there was a cinema, a bookshop that sold records, a performance space, a cafe, and this was a fantastic part of the post-war growth of the arts. And of course, many of those art centers have disappeared now, but at that time, they were a very important part of the cultural life, not only of their individual cities, but they created a network. Yeah. So you could do gigs across the UK, which is it's almost impossible now. And you could distribute magazines and books and records and cassettes through, you got to know people. And maybe you were going for a gig, or maybe you were going for a little, seaside adventure or something, and you could take some magazines and books and records with you and sell them.
Okay, I have a maybe very naive question. When I consider the time you started this, very, very early 70s, meaning Beatles all over the place. And suddenly you come with this kind of music. How was the reaction? How did this idea came to be? Using field recordings on stage and things like this. In my opinion, okay, I was 5 years, so I didn't remember it at all. This is so different than this. Yeah, maybe this Austin Powers atmosphere that you lived
in. To me, Austin Powers Beatles is 1960s in London. So 70s was quite a different feeling. There was a lot of progressive rock around, and there was some crossover, between progressive rock and the scene we were involved in, thinking of people like Robert Fripp, for example, who was very interested. Robert knew Frank Perry very well, for example. And yeah, there were a lot of interconnections, but you asked me what was the reaction, and I would say virtually none.
The people, how did they react to your doing on stage, to your music?
Mostly very badly, and the audiences were tiny. When we started in 1970, 71, we were playing at the Little Theatre Club in London, and you would get audiences of 2. And that was true also for the more established improvisers, like Derek Bailey. There's this story that Derek Bailey played at the Little Theatre Club to an audience of 2 people, and one of them was Dave Holland and the other was John McLaughlin.
Wow.
I guess it's very easy to ignore the stuff that you don't understand.
Well, it was very new. It was a new way of thinking about music that had been, there's a history that goes back to, I don't know, the 1950s or even earlier, but the main development started in the 1960s, and it was an incredibly new form of music, and people didn't like it, and there was some exposure on the BBC. And in fact, I was involved in an event Sunday, just gone, a television documentary from that time, 1975, has been unearthed. And we watched the documentary, and then there was a panel discussion with myself and Evan Parker and Max Easley from the original people who were in it. It was based on this book I edited in '74 called New Rediscovered Musical Instruments. And that television program showed on the commercial channel, ITV, and it was seen by 1 million people.
Okay.
And then it was repeated the next day at tea time. And it was seen by something like another 700,000 people. I mean, extraordinary. But so there was some exposure on the radio and a little tiny bit on television, but people basically didn't like the music. And it took a long, long time. I mean, now, you know, I'm incredibly busy and I'm doing many, many projects, and many of them are what you might call archive projects, like the VOD box set. And so there's quite a healthy interest in this period. But at the time, it was extraordinarily difficult. And that's why we produced our own magazine, Music's Magazine, which was collected together in this huge edition by Thurston Moore and Eva Prince a few years back. And, you know, we started our own labels. So many of the main labels that released this kind of music were musician-run labels like Incus and Bead Records and Quartz Monoton Cassettes. Because there was no other way.
Just the name of the label, Mirliton, is a French word for me, but I mean, it's probably not the most exciting story, but I'm still curious about where the name comes from.
Yes. Paul and I both had publishing companies, and mine was called Quartz and his was called Mirliton. And Quartz was named because I was very interested in shamanism, and I was reading Mircea Eliade's famous book on shamanism. And there was a whole passage in there about Australian Aboriginal Indigenous people and the significance of quartz crystals in their spiritual practices and mythology. And the quartz crystal was considered to be kind of inspirational. And then Mirliton, we knew about Mirlitons for these buzzing instruments, you know, like kazoos, but we were also very interested in anthropology and ethnomusicology, and there were very interesting things written about Mirlitons used, particularly in Africa, West Africa, Central Africa, as voice disguises. So they would represent the voice of spirits. And we loved the not the Horniman Museum, the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, where they have examples of these voice disguises from places like Nigeria. So on the one hand, there's this element of inspiration, and on the other hand, there's this element of disguise. And so that's how it came to be named.
Knowing what I know about you and your history, now I can just imagine how much of a shock it must have been for you to discover Mauricio Kagel's Exotica.
I don't know if it was a shock, but yes, I was aware of that record. I have most of those cargo records from that time. And if I'm honest with you, I mean, I love some of his music. I loved his attitude as a composer, but I didn't really like that record. It seemed dubious to me.
Yeah, it's because it's a modern Western composer using solely non-Western instruments, and the concept of exotica is dear to you.
Yes, I mean, I also didn't like the way they were kind of dressed up and painted on the cover and all of that stuff. It seemed to me, dubious in that respect. And of course, they were virtuoso musicians, so it was strange in that sense as well. But yeah, I mean, as I say, we were very interested in anthropology and ethnomusicology, and some of my biggest inspirations were global musics of various kinds, you know, sacred flute music from New Guinea, which a few years after Quartz Molten Cassettes, I started my own record label, initially supported by Evan Parker and Robert Wyatt. And the first two records I released were Sacred Flute Music from New Guinea, recorded by an anthropologist friend of mine, Ragnar Johnson. So that was a very important part of our references, you would say. And we were making instruments from early on, making our own instruments. Paul was making percussion instruments and bamboo trumpets and fiddles of various kind, and I was making flutes and so on. So I suppose our approach was quite different, but also the instruments we were using were things you'd never seen before. You know, so coming back to this, what I was saying, the newness of it, you know, it took a long time for people to, I mean, I would say it wasn't until the 90s that people really started to get interested in this scene.
That would have been my next question. So what's so impressive now, 5 decades later, as an observer, that you stick for all those years without being acknowledged, and now that's wrong, without having a proper audience, can I say it in that way? But you know what I mean. I can imagine that this is quite exhausting in a way over this long of a period of time.
Yeah, exhausting and also very dispiriting and soul destroying, I would say. You know, and I think Paul's death, his early death, it has a lot to do with that. For my part, I cheated. I became a music critic in the early 80s, and by 1985, I was a full-time music critic. I'd more or less given up at least playing music live. I was after a few years later. After that, I started learning how to make music on a computer, but that was a private thing. But a year into being a music critic, I wrote my first book, which was called Rap Attack. You know, and it was the second book on hip hop.
I heard that it was the first book.
No, there was one that came out in New York a few months beforehand, by a guy called Stephen Hager. And Rap Attack sort of changed my life in a way, and I started writing regularly for the Face magazine after that. And then, because the Face magazine was so popular and influential at that time, I started writing for a lot of people. So I had a career as a music journalist, and that went on until the mid-90s at least, more or less full time. And after the mid-90s, I started to get back into music. But 95, I wrote Ocean of Sound, and Ocean of Sound was, relatively speaking, a big success. Yes, you got the first translation. There's a new translation come out in France.
Yeah, well, I bought it back then and I read it back then, which was very interesting. It's called Ocean of Sound: Ambient Music, Imaginary Worlds, and the Voice of the Ether. I'm translating from the French, so I don't know if it was true. For me, it was an interesting book because it's not like a history book. It's more like vignettes in a way, like you being again a witness of these people, hanging with them, traveling with them, and analyzing it in a not, I wouldn't say casual way, but like in a light-hearted way, with your perspective from having been doing that since the early 70s. And so in a way, I must say that when I read it first, I was a little bit disappointed, and I reread it recently from more from the perspective of reading a book rather than looking for information. This is, of course, very informative if you are looking for information, and if you're not like a crazy trained spotter like I already was back then. but still, of course, it's one of these books I actually did a lot of annotations in back then, which I usually don't. But in this one, I did. You can see it's dog-eared everywhere. And as you were saying, this was soon followed. You did a CD compilation, I think, which I haven't heard, but like you did. That's one of the interesting things is that you were traveling around in clubs and reading excerpts of that with the compilation in the background, which led you to do this, which in my opinion is probably the album that is the biggest, the best example of what you were about in the 90s and early 2000s, still to this day.
Interesting. Yeah. Ocean of Sound was an opportunity to bring together all of the ideas that I'd been having for this, I suppose, since the 1960s. I'm really beginning to think seriously about music and how music interconnected. That was the thing that really interested me. And when you've been involved in this very marginalized music scene, where, nobody is interested and everybody thinks it's just a big mistake, then you really think hard about how does this music connect with other forms of music. It's not just an aberration. It's not just a kind of moment of craziness. There are serious reasons why this music exists. And I was also interested in so many other different forms of music. I mean, potentially any form of music, actually. From country music to opera to easy listening to death metal, potentially I'm interested in any of it. So Ocean of Sound was an attempt to connect things up more. Everything had been separated out into genres, and that to me was to some extent a commercial decision. It just makes things easier to sell. It makes things easier to recognize and identify. But to me, they're all connected. And it also enabled me to write about popular forms of music and in the same context write about this very obscure, very marginalized improvised music scene or the experimental scene that I was involved in. And basically, I was saying it's all the same. It's all very different, but it's also all the same. It's human activity. It's human cultural activity.
You used a word earlier that is very dear to me, that I think I got from reading Wire magazine, but it's a word that it took a little while for me to adopt it as my own religion, but that was very liberating, which is global music, rather than saying world music or whatever.
Yeah, I don't like this term world music because it separates out certain musics, and I think it's more productive and it's more generous to think about global music. And of course, everything exists in different contexts, and there's a huge difference between a commercial pop record made in Los Angeles and, sold by a big record corporation and music that's made in a small village and is participated in by all the people of the village, and it has a specific meaning and a specific affect. So, Ocean of Sound was an attempt to articulate these ideas, but I think it also helped me to get back to what I'd been doing in the 1970s, because in a way I'd rejected all that. As you say, Michael, it was a very difficult thing to deal with for so long. No money, no recognition. And, the reason I got into music writing was because I just couldn't, I was 34. I just couldn't take it with no money anymore. It was just too hard.
There are three quite interesting questions from the gallery, if you don't mind, because they surround this whole topic. One question: considering the lack of fan base in the beginning, did the band or the group discuss changing directions? Or did you say, no, we stick, you stick to it? Has there been this kind of discussions within the group you played?
Yes, but the hilarious, ridiculous thing is that it went the other way. We started as a rock band. We started as a rock band, and we played with quite a lot of different people.
Yeah.
You know, for example, there was a bass player who looked a bit like Jimi Hendrix, and you know, he had a really cool image and everything, and he played with us once. I still have the tapes of that, actually. They're the first tapes that were ever made, and they're like this crazy free rock music with him playing riffs, and Paul and I was playing electric guitar, very distorted electric guitar, and Paul was playing drums, and we were playing this kind of free stuff around his riffs. And then we played with violin players, singers, any number of people. And they would all last for 1 or 2 sessions, and then they would disappear because we were just too strange and radical, I suppose. I mean, you know, you can imagine doing it now. We ended up a duo, guitar and drums. And in those days, it just seemed impossible to do that. And now, you know, more recently, you've had these bands like Lightning Bolt, for example, you know, that can do that sort of thing. You know, you could have a guitar drum duo now, and you could play free music, and everybody would love it. You know, but then it was just impossible. So Paul signed up to be an art student at Ealing College of Art. I'd been an art student in the 1960s, and I dropped out. But he signed up because he was working as a grave digger at the time, and it was just, you know, depressing, unbearable. So he thought, I'll be an art student instead. And the famous drummer John Stevens from the Spontaneous Music Ensemble had been invited to give improvisation workshops by Christopher Small. Christopher Small is well known now for being a music writer. He wrote fantastic books like Musicking is a very influential book. But at that time, he was teaching music at the Ealing College, and he invited John Stevens in to give workshops. And Paul and I attended these workshops because we were hungry to learn, you know, more about what we were doing. John gave us gigs at the little theatre club, and so suddenly we were involved in this free improvisation scene. And that was our lifeline. And it was the same with meeting Bob Cobbing, which was a complete accident, by the way. Paul's partner, Sheila Cobbing, was pregnant, and they thought they should go and see her father. And they went to see her father, and they were all embarrassed about discussing the subject of her pregnancy. So they started talking about art and music, and it turned out that her father was this famous sound poet, Bob Cobbing. And at the end of the meeting, said, well, let's work together. So that's how that happened. And so Bob had contacts into the poetry scene, the sound poetry scene, electronic music, and so on. So, you know, that was our way of surviving. So, you know, we'd already failed at the commercial bit. So it wasn't possible for us to say, let's sell out and, you know, try and make some money, because we already knew we couldn't do that.
But at some point, Brian Eno, with his obscure label, got aware of your group and took ideas and musicians from your group, right? How when was it? How came this to be? How does that feel? How do we have to imagine this period?
Well, as I've said already, I edited a book called New Rediscovered Musical Instruments in 1974, and Paul and I published it. I think Writers Forum as well was involved. And this brought together a core group. So Max Eastley, Hugh Davis, myself, Paul, Evan Parker, Paul Litton were
Gavin
the...
Bryars maybe as well?
No. Gavin
yeah.
Bryars and Michael Nyman helped to distribute it because they had a thing called Experimental Music Catalogue. But no, they weren't involved. And I sent a copy to Brian. I don't know how I knew his address, but I sent a copy to Brian, and he phoned me up and said, I'm starting a label called Obscure. Maybe he didn't know the name of the label at that time. I'm starting a label, and would you like to do something? So he came to see me and Paul and Max Eastley play, and he fell asleep, which he said was a compliment. And this was the same time when Paul and I split up as a duo. So in the end, the record was one side Max Eastley, one side myself. But I was playing with Paul, Frank Perry, Hugh Davies, who were all, of course, on Quartz Melditon cassettes. So you can see how this little core group was very tightly connected.
Mm.
You know, we were interested in each other's ideas. We played together. We had some of the same concerns, and you know, so you can see it. That's 1975. Quartz Melditon cassettes was 1977. So you can see how that was a continuation, really, of this little scene within a scene. That Quartz Melditon cassettes was a way of publishing informal documents, audio documents of this little group, really.
You made me think about something somewhat similar that happened a few years even before that, which is the first album, or the first album under his name of Basil Kirshen, The World Within Words, which features Evan Parker and had liner notes by Brian Eno on Columbia.
Yeah, I had that record. I still have that record. In fact, I was looking for something yesterday and I found it. I have that one and the follow-up record, and that was an interesting initiative of bringing together bioacoustic sounds, which I was incredibly interested in. You know, bird sounds, animal sounds, insect sounds, and marine mammal sounds, and also improvisation. So Derek Bailey, Evan Parker, I think Tony Oxley played on that first record. And Brian was very interested in that stuff. I mean, I think Brian was very, you know, he was in a new phase of his career. I used to go around to his flat at that time, and we'd just talk about ideas and stuff, and he'd be working on various things. I remember I went around once and he was working on this cover version of The Lion Sleeps Tonight, which he, I think, released as a single. So, you know, there was a connection between us, and also there were big differences between us. And I was very committed to this improvised music scene, which was, you know, less interesting to him. But then he was doing, making records like Another Green World, which was sort of, in a way, composing for improvisers, I would say, and using the studio itself as an instrument, which was something that became very interesting to me later on. But there's a big box set coming out of Obscure Records, released in Italy. And that's being worked on at the moment. In fact, that's 2 box sets. So it's going to be a box of CDs, a box of vinyl with a very long essay. And I have to write a text myself for it in the next couple of weeks. So, you know, there's a kind of deluge of boxes from that period, and it's so interesting. Going back, the first question you asked was, how did this come about? And one of the things I thought when Frank first suggested this to me was that there's something wrong with the idea of, something like this with, handwritten
Yeah.
cover. This is just a photocopy in here. So everything is just handmade, and maybe we made 5 copies of each or 10 copies of each. Everything is low budget, lo-fi, and then to make this astonishing high production box set. What does that mean? And it was a little bit the same with the Musics magazine publication that Ecstatic Peace Library made. That they worked so hard on that, and they made it look so beautiful. And originally it was this very badly printed magazine that was sometimes very difficult to read, and some of the photos you couldn't see.
Nowadays, this has an amazing appeal. When you see it now in 2023, just the cassette you just showed with this small picture, it has a certain appeal, and maybe, as you also can hear in today's music, you had for certain a huge impact 5 decades later, which also is, in my opinion, a very interesting question, because when you listen to today's music, certain kind of music, you have to hear there is a lot of your ideas from the 70s into this kind of music nowadays. Also, this design, the look and feel has been heavily adapted, in my opinion, in today's, let's call it avant-garde, in lack for a better word, avant-garde music. So how does that feel after all this hustle and pain?
It's very interesting, because I included a lot of posters in the books for the QMC box, and these posters were, just done with collage and stencils, and then taken to a photocopy shop in the high street, and you get a number of copies run off and take them to bookshops or whatever, record shops, and they would put them up. And of course, there were very few design skills. I did actually train as a graphic designer for a while, but most of these posters, they're completely free and very quickly done. And there came a point, I can't remember when it was, but I think I did an exhibition about the London Musicians Collective at some time in the 2000s, and I included some of these posters in the exhibition. And this was in London College of Communication, where I was a professor. And that was partly a graphic design school, graphic design photography college. And many of the design people were incredibly interested in these posters, and they really loved the aesthetic of them. And at first that was hard to understand, but then you think about it, that everything now is kind of based on grids, and everything can be extremely professional. You can make a book yourself or a record or whatever, and everything is incredibly professional and perfect, actually. And so I think for people who are at the beginning of that process and maybe feeling trapped in the grid, to see these very free, wild kind of posters with crazy, handwritten stuff and stencils and broken electroset and photos stolen from here and there, photocopied and cut up. It was just exciting, and I think in a way it's the same with listening to some lo-fi recordings, that everything can be so clean and perfect now. So to hear something that's really dirty, but it's just people who, believe in what they're doing and, are kind of desperate to get something out, even though they have no resources to do so. There's something so committed about it that it's sort of almost frightening. You know, it's like, okay, this is the best you can do. Given your resources, your lack of resources, but you're determined to do it. So that commitment and determination, I know from personal experience of teaching, was really fascinating to students, because for them, you know, particularly art students, you know, the prospect is that you would try to get with a gallery and you would try to become successful. And then, you know, if you achieve that path, then everything was laid out for you. And then we were suddenly looking at all of these artifacts from the art world and from the music world that were just like, okay, we have no money, no resources, we just do it. You know,
Let's do it.
that spirit of let's just do it. It was inspiring to them, and I've talked to many students who are like, wow, how did you do this? You know, how is it possible? And I say, well, you know, you just work with each other, you support each other, and you do what you can with what you have. And that to them was a revelation.
It's interesting because what you just said is my own personal definition of what punk is. And I think that in that sense, like doing whatever you can with the best you can with whatever you have, and which is exactly what you did, and seeing this now being made official, I can imagine there could be a sort of fear of it becoming sort of coffee table-ish, and which would go quite against the original nature of it.
Yeah, we never had coffee tables back then. So it is strange. There was a contradiction, obviously. But I think when you reach a contradiction, it can do one of two things. It can completely stop you, you know, so that you can't move. You're frozen by the contradiction. Or you can decide on a path that takes you maybe around or through the contradiction. And when it came to the point of being asked about doing the Quartz Marathon box or the music's book, I think you have to accept that there's a real value in making this work much more available to people who have that interest now. And there are a lot of people around the world who have that interest. You know, I travel a lot. I have traveled a lot. And wherever you go, there's a huge interest. So, for example, the first time I went to Japan was with Max Easley in 1993, and we did a little tour of Japan. And everywhere we went, people said obscure records were so influential on us. You know, composers and musicians there, they had bought all the obscure records and they had kind of absorbed what was on them, and it had contributed to the aesthetic of music making, contemporary music making in Japan. Now, that was a huge shock to me, because inevitably you look back and you think this stuff is so obscure in both senses of the word, so obscure, so marginal, so forgotten, so ignored in its time. Nobody knows about it. It has no effect. But that's not the case. So I think there's a great value in bringing these things together. The other thing I feel is that the materials themselves are so ephemeral, so fragile. You know, many of these materials I have in cardboard files, and they're ancient pieces of paper. You know, this cassette here, if I take out the paper cover, it's brittle and it's yellow, you know. And it really struck me when Paul died. You know, Paul died in tragic circumstances. And, you know, everything he had was in danger of being lost. And it was only because, you know, some friends, close friends, and to some extent his sons, you know, gathered this material together, that it was saved from being lost. This is a thing that happens so often. And to be given the opportunity, once I got over my misgivings, about the coffee table aspect of it, I thought this is a great opportunity to collect this material together that we were all doing in one place, so people can make sense of it, and it's preserved, if you like. I mean, not preserved. I mean, it's a living thing because I'm still working. You know, Max Easley is still working. Evan Parker is still working. You know, we're still active. And there's a direct connection between what we're doing now and what we were doing 50 years ago. So it's a living thing, but at the same time, somebody can buy this box or, you know, maybe find it in an archive or something.
But you know what? There's a philosophical thread with that, in the sense that, yes, it's archived, but it's archived on an analog medium, which means that eventually someone in the future will have to take the baton if it has to be preserved again, which means that you still give history a chance to deem it as it was in the beginning when you started this, and you said it was absolutely not successful because it couldn't, because it was so new. Then I would argue that, yeah, it couldn't, but at the same time, it could have been vastly successful. One person could be the lucky person who, like maybe Yoko Ono, to a certain degree at one point, be the one that is accepted for her weirdness. But by the 90s, as you said, I guess that it's probably less possible to be hugely successful from doing something very obscure, but there will be a niche, there will be a family, because that music has now a history and has value, accepted value. Time gave it a chance, and this box set gives a chance for newer generations to value this however they will.
And
Yes.
one sentence, please, then I'm quiet. I want to bring the Hollywood aspect to this box set now. I mean, this is a happy ending from all what you have told now, and you showed this one cassette, and now you have 2 of these box sets you can grab, listen to, share, and yeah, I think it's amazing. You even said yourself that you don't have that many material of what you have done in those decades, and now you have this box set. To me, that's a happy ending. Sorry, maybe I watch too many Hollywood movies, but I like the outcome.
Yeah, I like happy endings sometimes as well. And it's particularly gratifying, you know, to go through this long trajectory from meeting Paul just randomly in 1969 and, you know, his life coming to an end prematurely. And also it was the case, you know, Hugh Davis died relatively young, and Christopher Small died, Herman Hogue died. Bob Cobbing was, well, he was 80, so, you know, he'd had a long life, but, you know, the others, you could say that they died prematurely, and it's a way of honoring that legacy, you know, and to clarify from our point of view, or at least my point of view, what happened and what the connections were. Because in my role as a professor, which I'm now retired from that, but I was supervising and examining PhDs, and people were beginning to do PhDs on these subjects. So, for example, I examined a PhD on Hugh Davis some years ago, and one of the things, I won't say the name of the person who did the PhD, and it was very good in a way, but it left out completely his work in improvisation and this kind of work. And myself and the other examiner said to him, you know, you've omitted a hugely important part of his practice, and you have to include that. And the person who done the PhD, he was devastated, but he had to go back and add in that material. So that's how easy it is to misunderstand, you know, these historical events. And so for me, it was important to say, and of course I've done this in many other contexts, and I've written books on this subject, but you know, from our point of view, this is how things happened. This is what happened. This is how things were connected. And so people don't have an excuse now, you know, to get things wrong.
Right. Well said. Yeah. That's true. You have the chance now. When you're on the hunt for the quartz militant cassettes, you have a very good excuse if you don't get one. No,
yes, that's right. Yes, yes. Until this year, it was almost impossible, or I would say impossible. But now it's well, it's not so easy necessarily because it's quite expensive. But I think it's very worthwhile because the amount of material in there and the love and attention to detail is fantastic.
You know what? It is very expensive, but at the same time, it's not expensive like buying a car. So it gives you also time to reflect. It offers a question to the people who might be interested in it, which is already something creative, in my opinion. So it's already a success. Like, do I want to welcome all this information and this art in my life? And that's always a good question, I think.
Stanti, for once, I will correct you, but only once. I think your car example is not good. I have a better example. It's not much more expensive than the upcoming Dark Side of the Moon box set, which has 2 LPs in it, and I think 5 CDs and a Blu-ray. So I think that puts it very well into perspective.
Yeah.
Yes, and you can also compare it to an art print.
Yeah.
So if you buy an art print by a moderately successful, well-known artist, you're going to be paying at least £1,500 for an art print. You know, if you're paying £400, then you're probably buying something by an artist who's unknown. So, you know, this is a strange thing about the record business, that it's always thought about as a mass market medium of multiples. But, you know, there are some things that don't quite fit into that, those criteria. And it's a bit out of date anyway, because, you know, we have so few record shops left now. You know, the ones that are left tend to be very good ones, very fantastic record shops. But compared to the 1970s, when every town had at least 2 record shops and cities had hundreds of them. So now you're really thinking much more about either downloading stuff or, you know, artworks to some extent. But, you know, this way of thinking has been established over the past 100 or so years, and so it's very difficult to shake it off. But you know, if you're buying this box, or boxes in a way, we should say, then you're getting something really unique.
That's for sure.
It's funny to just think. So some people might buy one box and not the second one, which is weird in a way.
Is that possible, son? Or is it possible?
Yeah, it is. Yeah,
right. You can. Yeah, you're right. You're right.
Which brings. I had this thought at the beginning of this, that like also a falsely naive question, which is like, why did they do 2 box sets when both are released at the same time? We know why, but
we know why. Yes, and there was a lot of discussion about this, in fact, and at a certain point, Frank said to me, "This is impossible, and how do you feel about this?" And I felt okay. You know, I mean, my work is based on trust. I work with people I trust. I don't really like contracts very much. I don't really like situations where you're suspicious of people, and I get a feeling about people. And if I get a feeling that I don't trust them, then I just withdraw, or sometimes it gets further advanced and you think, oh, how do I get out of this one? Because something is revealed about the person that you don't really like. It's not really a matter of personal taste. It's just, the way of doing things. If somebody's doing things in the right way and they're not underhanded and so on. And Frank, I trusted. And so when he said, I can't do it this way, I have to do it this way. Yeah, I'm flexible.
But have you been aware of Vinyl on Demand, the label, before you got contacted by Frank Bull? Have you been aware?
I was aware of the LAFMS box set, but I think that was after. Yeah, that was after Frank first contacted me. But before then, I wasn't aware because a lot of the music he releases is not particularly to my taste. So,
I thought Soviet France also might.
Yeah. Soviet France. I suppose the other thing to say is that my relationship to music listening has changed.
Okay.
And I think Quartz Molotov Cassettes was very much about an emergent form that we now call sound art. But it didn't have a name then.
Mm-hmm.
It was just, people doing odd, eccentric things, sound sculpture, improvisation, playing by the sea, or in forests or whatever, doing long duration performances in once industrial buildings, that kind of thing. It was all interconnected, but it didn't have a name. Now we call it sound art.
Mm-hmm.
I've forgotten what I was going to say. Losing my mind. I was talking about
how you listen to music.
Oh, how I listen to music. Yes, thank you. And I think I've come full circle in that I'm very much concerned with listening. And listening is something I talk about in lectures, and it's very much a key to my practice now, I would say. So I listen, for example, on YouTube to many different things. I still love soul music, for example. So I'll listen to tracks on YouTube and often finding obscure things. But the idea of sitting down to listen to albums or going out to buy records is nowhere near as important to me as it once was. And I think I'm so fully immersed in what I now call a listening practice and the way that relates to my own thinking and my own practice, my own writing, my own music making, whether it's live improvisation or, composing in the computer. There's much more emphasis on that than there is on listening to records.
So you are still active in creating and composing music?
Absolutely, yeah. Very busy. I've done quite a few gigs this year. I quite soon I have a new record coming out with Lawrence English.
Wow.
I have a new record just come out with Tanya Caroline Chen. I've recently released another solo record. So yeah, more and more busy actually.
All on vinyl, I hope. Sorry to have to say.
Yeah, mostly on vinyl. Not all.
Is really into vinyl. But it took us 40 minutes to actually name that your instrument of trade at least used to be the guitar in this discussion today. Then you started to use electronics, and also maybe because of circumstances, your voice also became one of your instruments in a very different way than these two other instruments. How is it today with your voice as an instrument?
Actually, I just mentioned this new record that's coming out with Lawrence English, a record called Shell That Speaks the Sea, and it's mostly field recordings by Lawrence, and I added to them. And what happened was he'd sent me a whole batch of field recordings a couple of years ago, and I'd done nothing. And then last year, I was in Switzerland, in Geneva, for a festival. I was playing there with Max Eastley and Steve Beresford. And we all caught COVID. So we all came back and we were all ill with the virus. And the first thing that happened to me was that my voice dropped. You know, like kind of suddenly I was Barry White. And I thought, I felt very ill, but I thought I must do something with this. So I started to record it, and I started singing, and I found myself singing the Cheers story, which I'd recorded for the Obscura record in 1975. And I sang all the way through it, and I made that into a track. So that track is going to be on the forthcoming record with Lawrence English, a cover version of my own song. Nearly 50 years later. But to answer your question, I use different setups according to who I'm working with. So sometimes I'll use electric guitar. Like if I'm playing with Thurston Moore, I'll use electric guitar, lap steel electric guitar. I use flutes. I use homemade instruments. Some instruments I use are the same instruments I was using in 1972. So they have this really long life. And also I use another setup, which is bone conduction speakers, paper, cardboard boxes, leaves, you know. So I'm still doing the same things more or less that I was doing back then, but I'm doing new things as well.
From my outside perception, considering a lot of the tradition or the habit of in avant-garde experimental music, you seem to have to at least release much more collaboration rather than solo recordings, which are like at one point I was almost thinking David Toop he's always like he must have a really good address book or something.
Yes, collaboration is incredibly important to me. And I think that comes partly from the ethos of Quartz Merleton cassettes, that we exist to support each other. Mm-hmm. And if we can't support each other, then there's something missing from the way we approach life. And so I love working with other people. For 10 years, I ran an improvisation course at London College of Communication, and a number of those students who went through my improvisation classes I now work with. They're friends, they've become friends since they graduated, and I work with them. So that means I'm working with very young people, which of course is amazing for me. Just fresh ideas, new strategies, new ways of thinking about the music, you know, not encumbered by the baggage that people of my age carry around. And I also work with musicians I've collaborated with for nearly 50 years. And so I think there's something healthy in that, you know, that you don't reject your own contemporaries and colleagues, which means you're not rejecting your own history, your own ancestry, your own age, but you're also open to working with very young people who are much less experienced, but they have fresh new ideas.
It's refreshing that you like the young people, but that's another story. There is one question I like to know. Winston has the feeling that you like Frank Zappa. Is he right? What's your take on Frank Zappa?
No, sorry to disappoint, but no, I don't much. I actually was at the famous Royal Albert Hall concert by the Mothers of Invention, the one that ended up being included on Uncle Meat. So I have a very good memory of. I was actually sitting on the stage. It was at the Royal Albert Hall, and sometimes they have audience sitting on the stage, more or less behind the band. And I had one of those seats, so I remember the incident very clearly of them playing Louis Louis with the Royal Albert Hall pipe organ, and some guy coming up with a trumpet and wanting to sit in with them. So I kind of liked that period, and the first few records, the Mothers of Invention records, I still like those a lot. But after that, no, sorry.
Good answer.
Yeah, for sure. Nice take from David Barnes. The box set seems a culmination, but how optimistic are you for the whole genre looking forward?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure what genre is because I don't think of it as a genre. You know, if you take what I do now, so my last solo LP, Apparition Paintings, which came out on Room 40, every track is different. And so there's, you know, a twangy guitar, like pop track, which is my homage to Brian Wilson instrumentals from Pet Sounds. And then there are extremely abrasive tracks. There are songs. There are field recording tracks. There's a track which has a kind of African funk feel. And people say, you know, why all these different things? And one of my answers was that I've always loved soundtrack albums. You know, I love John Barry and Ennio Morricone. And if you buy an Ennio Morricone album, a soundtrack album, then the journey you go on is crazy. You know, one track, you know, say an album like Fistful of Dollars.
Yeah.
You know, you have this beautiful melody, fantastic melody. And then the next track you have is some weird experimental improvised sounding track, you know, very atmospheric. And then you have twangy guitars, and, you know, you listen to it as a whole, going through many different styles. So anyway, to come back to the question, am I optimistic? Yeah, of course I'm optimistic, because I play constantly now to quite big audiences, sometimes very big audiences. I have constant requests to write. I'm working on many reissue projects. So last year, 2 of my releases on Virgin Records from the 90s were reissued by these very young guys in their early 20s, you know, who are into ambient and electronic music and dance music and so on. And they really liked those.
Pink Noir, right?
Pink Noir and Spirit World, yes. So they combine them together in a double album. The Obscura box set is being released. So all of these different periods of my, I won't say career, it's more like a calling. It's not really a career, but all of these different things from my history are being reissued, which indicates that there is a continuing interest. And, you know, as long as I have the health and energy to continue, then I see myself as being, you know, very busy, and the audience for what I do is very receptive. So extremely optimistic. I mean, Sunday I was at this event which was about jazz and improvised music on UK television in the 1970s. So you would think that sounds, yeah, kind of interesting if you're a little bit into it, but otherwise maybe a bit boring. It was full. Cafe Otto was full of people, you know, and this is normal now.
And this is beautiful, right? And well deserved.
Yeah, well, I think I think if you stick with something and you have the good fortune to more or less keep your health and keep your energy, then eventually it can pay off. And I'm just sad for the people who, sadly died before they saw this happening.
Yeah, that you stick to it. That I remember the first talk I had with Stunty when this Quartz Militant box set came to me, and I wanted to do the video. One of the key aspects he said for him, sorry to quote you, of course can explain by yourself a little later. One of the key aspects is you just stick to it. You said, this is what we do, we stick to it for a decade. And that's or more than, yeah, right. Yeah. This is a key aspect, I think, of your doing as a musician, right? Is that safe to say? Is that correct?
It's correct, and it's what I say to students. If you want to achieve something, you have to be very determined. Maybe you'll become successful, but then maybe that success will disappear, or maybe you won't become successful. But if you're committed to what you do, then you have to be extremely determined, because life can be very hostile to new ideas.
The latest studying in gene biology is now concluding that talent is just a social construct. It doesn't exist. It's just work, ethics, and endurance.
Albert Einstein, genius is a 10% inspiration and 90% transpiration.
Yes, yeah, there's a lot of truth in that. I mean, I think there are some people who are extremely gifted, and but they still have to work hard. If you think of the example of Charlie Parker, he was laughed at when he was a very young musician, and he just went away and practiced and practiced and practiced, and he came back, and what he was doing was frightening. Nobody else could do it. Yeah. So even somebody like that, there's a tremendous amount of hard work, and I think some people get confused here about virtuosity. They think the only good musician is one who plays a million notes, and there's a lot of that on YouTube these days. But that's not what art is about. Art is about changing people's perceptions. You're holding an ocean of sound.
Because am I correct to remember that you are the one who taught me that anecdote about Charlie Parker chasing Varese in the streets of New York?
It's an ocean of sound, yes. Charlie Parker was in awe of Edgar Varese and wanted to study with him, but Parker died before that happened, and Varese ended up working with Charles Mingus. Okay. But yes, it's one of the reasons why it's important to read biographies and autobiographies, I think, because then you realize that everybody struggles. Somebody like Charlie Parker, who's sometimes, unfortunately, more famous for his drug problems than for his music, but the turmoil and conflict in somebody like that, the pain they're going through, is reflected in the bad aspect of their lives, the drug addiction or the alcoholism or whatever it is. So, yeah, you need a lot of stamina. You need a lot of determination. You need a lot of self-belief. And I must say, speaking personally, I had no confidence in myself and my work until Ocean of Sound was published, and it was relatively successful. It was the first time it had lots of reviews. It was the first time certainly the first time it had lots of positive reviews. And I thought, oh, maybe what I'm doing is okay after all. But that was 1995. So, that was 25 years of feeling no confidence in myself.
But how was, when this book was a success, does that also reflect on your Quartz Merliton label, or was it too far away from the topic in a way? Or had that an impact? on the music.
I wrote about my work with Paul Burwell in Ocean of Sound. Yes, it was. I thought about Ocean of Sound as a Trojan horse, something that you sneak into the city, and then when it's dark, you will jump out and take the city over. This ambient music, electronic ambient music thing was very, very popular at that time. And it was a way of writing about the things that weren't popular.
Mm.
So you introduce people to things that they would otherwise not encounter. You're not trying to sell them on it. You're just saying, these ideas are all in some way interconnected. And if you're genuinely open to this music, then at some point it will lead you to this music,
Yeah.
which you never thought you would ever be interested in.
You need bridges.
You need
Yeah.
bridges, of course. You need bridges, and I'm very happy to make bridges between easy listening music and extreme noise or whatever, because
It's
I
quite
know what the connections are.
it's quite unrealistic to expect people to go from Britney Spears to La Monte Young. It's like you need étape stages.
You need a story. You need a story to carry you there, in a way. And the human beings have survived by stories, and they've survived the ups and downs of life by telling themselves stories, telling each other stories. And I guess I realized early on, somehow I never managed to write fiction, even though I read fiction all the time. And in a way, I would love to be able to write novels, but I think that love of stories has carried over into the way I write about music.
If Michael is okay with that, talking about connections, I wanted to show you a few records and have that will illustrate how wide the spectrum of your career is and that will be limiting it already, because it is more than what I'm just gonna show. And is it okay, Michael?
Of course, it's a great idea.
So this record features bands that were somewhat popular at one point, SPK and Hula, and General Strike. General Strike is a band that had very few records, and in which David Toop was playing.
Yeah, it was
here with us.
Basically, General Strike was a duo of myself and Steve Beresford, and we started the group by releasing a single around the same time that our work with David Cunningham's group, the Flying Lizards, was coming out. And so we worked with David Cunningham as a producer, and General Strike was really a reflection of all of the music that we were listening to, from Sun Ra to dub reggae to doo-wop ballads to African juju to I don't know, very wide. And Sub Rosa, I think I met up with Gimark from Sub Rosa when he came to London around that time, and we were invited. I was invited to record some tracks, and so yeah, we recorded a General Strike track, not with David Cunningham.
From which year is this album?
This is from 83 or 84. But it's interesting because I didn't think about that, but last year Sub Rosa released a record that is quite interesting in regard of an earlier part of our discussion, which is these new recordings of ethnographical recordings that you did the liner notes of these Indonesia
Guns from Southeast Asia.
An amazing record. Like I played it and showed it. It's one of my favorite records from last year. It's which is also a testimony of a very nice surprise, which is that a lot of new generation are embracing these kind of recordings these days, which is a testimony of the work you've been doing for all this time, and also a long-lasting relationship, Sub Rosa, and you're still part of that.
I am still part of it. Yes, yeah. We've been talking about a new project actually relatively recently. So it's good to have these long relationships.
And you were talking about Steve Beresford. You had a long relationship with him as well.
Yeah, I have, and we played together quite recently, and that was a relationship with Motto Records in France, and that was kind of Steve's record. So they had festivals at Chantenay in France, and we played at the festivals in various configurations. There was one year when Steve Beresford, myself, and John Zorn played a trio, and we also made a record for Motto. So
And Steve is one of these names that also has been around for so much time, and who probably hasn't right now hasn't got the success he deserves. I think personally, because he's so versatile.
I've asked Steve about that in the past. I've said to him, you could have been a successful arranger, composer, orchestrator. Why didn't you take that path? And he said, what I'm doing is much more interesting. And it's simple, but it's true.
Yeah.
You can have a comfortable life working as a music arranger, working in studios and all the rest of it, which he's very capable of doing. Or you can have this incredibly interesting life working with amazing musicians and traveling all over the world, and Steve is relatively successful, I would say. In our world, he's very successful. He's very well known, and he's a huge influence. And he works with, he mentors a lot of young people and young musicians, and he brings many musicians into the scene, young musicians. He's incredible in what he does. He's still absolutely at the top of his game, I would say. And there he is on Quartz Melloton cassettes with this group called the Three Pullovers. It's
I wanted to speak to that.
Yeah. So and the Three Pullovers was such an interesting group because it was like a noise group, but everything was really quiet. Everything was played with incredible intensity, and frantic playing, but very, very quiet.
Okay.
And that was kind of revolutionary at the time because, Steve and I came up when there was still this free jazz era, which was terrible for me as a flute player, because you were getting these groups with 10 saxophone players and trombonists and trumpet players and drummers, and it's just like, wow. And, I would be hyperventilating after 10 minutes. Couldn't be heard at all. So, we Rain in the Face and, groups like the Three Pullovers, the Four Pullovers, they were very different, but and also the playing I was doing with Frank Perry, which was this very meditative music with gongs and, Frank's fantastic collection of percussion, and me playing flutes, and the work we did with Hugh Davis, where he was working with, all these electronic devices that he'd developed after working with Stockhausen and Stockhausen's technician, Jaap Speck. It was a very different approach, and it was about listening, and it was about small sounds and intensity and tactility. It was very different from what had come before.
It's okay, so I'm just reacting. It's pretty funny because the next record I wanted to show you was this.
What's that?
Stockhausen.
Oh, Stockhausen. I can't see it from there. Yeah, which one is it?
It's a pretty rare one because it was released on the French Electrola,
Yeah, I don't recognize it.
and it's a double LP. It's some of his, in my opinion, his best electronic stuff.
Which ones?
You have Spiral and Japan, Paul, Vach.
Do you want me to say something about it?
Well, I wanted to like this more tongue in cheek because the liner notes of this record are by a British guy named born
Richard Toop.
Exactly. He became Stockhausen's assistant and who did lots of liner notes for avant-garde music.
Yeah.
And from the same generation as you.
No, slightly older.
Slightly older.
Yeah, slightly older. In the 70s, people used to say, I see you're doing a piano recital at the Wigmore Hall. And I'm like, no, I can't play the piano. Richard Toop. Yeah. And then he probably got the same thing. Oh, I see you're playing an improvised music gig. But I met Stockhausen in Norway. Not so long before his death. He did a live well, it wasn't really a performance, it was a playback. He had this huge mixing desk, but he wasn't really using it, of Telemusic, which is my favorite Stockhausen piece. And I found myself in the hotel lobby waiting for somebody at the same time that he was waiting for a taxi. So I introduced myself and I said who I was, and I said I was a friend of Hugh Davis, and it was very sad that he died. And he said, yeah, it's very sad. And he looked at me and he said, Toop. Richard Toop is a very good writer. It was like, yeah, okay.
Yeah. Stockhausen wasn't the easiest guy.
No, he wasn't the easiest guy, but I was happy to meet him, and there's some of his work that I still think is fantastic. Yeah, particularly from that period of Telemusic and Hymnen and Momenta and Contactor and all of those pieces, fantastic.
Yeah. And someone else who you have nothing personally to do with, but I wanted to show these anyways.
Oh, Arthur Lyman. Yeah. Yeah, I love all that music. There's Baxter, Elizabeth Waldo, Arthur Lyman, Martin Denny. And of course, I wrote a book about them. And I've written another book, which is coming out this year, which is about Dr. John's Grigri album. So it's a book devoted just to that one record. And the background of the record and how it was made and where it was made and everything associated with it is a kind of forensic dissection of that one record. But there are references in that book to the Exotica movement and how it affected Grigri.
Well, and probably
Santi, let's do a break because there is a similar question.
Okay.
And I'm afraid if we don't put it on screen, we really get into serious trouble. Your take on a band called The Beatles?
The Beatles, that's a big question. Well, of course, my teenage years coincided with the rise of the Beatles. So in other words, in 1961, I would have been 12. So just moving into adolescent period, and I can't remember when the first Beatles records came out, but not long after that. So I was sort of growing up with them. Yeah. And of course, yes, it had a huge impact. I was more of a kind of Rolling Stones fan, to be honest. And the Rolling Stones took me very quickly, almost instantaneously, to the people they were influencing. So the first band I played in, I was playing guitar in a blues band or R&B band that formed just after the first Rolling Stones album came out, and we were covering some of those tracks. And immediately I wanted to know more about the original versions, which was not easy to do, partly because I didn't really have any money and those records were hard to get in those days. But there was, as you know, there was a R&B boom, a blues boom, a soul boom in the 1960s in the UK, and it became easier and easier to find those records and to hear them on the radio. You know, there were specialist blues shows on pirate radio, for example. And I quite quickly became a kind of scholar, you know, in that area. I would say that was my first area of scholarship, of, you know, researching blues as much as I could. But the Beatles, I think, yeah, I mean, it was a cultural phenomenon. So I remember gathering together with my friends, you know, to watch the live broadcast of All You Need Is Love. And I remember gathering together with friends on a Sunday morning, and we talked about Sergeant Pepper, you know, whether it was good or whether it wasn't good. You know, and there were arguments between us of, you know, track by track and what does this mean? And then when the White Album came out, you know, the more this mix of pop songs and novelty songs and heavy metal songs and experimental music was kind of interesting to me. Going back to what I said about my Apparition Paintings LP and Ennio Morricone, this idea that you can, that an LP doesn't have to be consistent. You can just, I mean, by that time, of course, every member of the Beatles wanted their say, you know, they wanted, so that's why it becomes more and more, you know, individual expressions or so. But yes, I mean, if I'm not the world's biggest Beatles fan, but of course it would be stupid to deny their impact, their social impact, their cultural impact, you know.
With this also might automatically an impact on you, right? It has to be socialization in a way, right?
Yes, of course. Yeah, the life you led, you know, your romantic encounters, and you know, the records you talked about at school, all of that kind of thing was, and the way they were influencing society in general. You know, that society was changing in a big way in the mid-60s, you know, 65, 66, 67. And of course, I was going to all of these gigs. And actually, I never saw the Beatles, and I could have done, but my parents stopped me. And
why?
I was very young. I was maybe 14, I suppose, you know, and it would have meant going to this concert hall, which was a bit of a journey because I lived out in the suburbs and it was a school night. So they said no. And I've sort of never forgiven them for that. Because not because I was a huge Beatles fan, but because, you know, obviously to say you have seen the Beatles is kind of ridiculous, yeah. But I did see the Rolling Stones play on the same tour as the Ronettes, so that's kind of good second best.
For sure. Angelo Kelly is quoting Wayne Shorter with an interesting quote, in my opinion. When I'm improvising, I'm composing fast. And when I'm composing, I'm improvising slow. What are your thoughts on this?
I think that quote maybe comes from somebody else that he may be quoting. And it's somebody like Schoenberg, although obviously it would be different. But yeah, I've been listening to a lot of Wayne Shorter recently because of his death, and ESP, Miles Davis with that incredible group with Wayne Shorter is one of my favorite records, and some tracks on that are just absolutely extraordinary, mesmerizing. I think Wayne Shorter as a composer was really unbelievable. You know, he was so incredible in what he was doing, melodically, harmonically. You know, the way he approached the idea of a jazz ballad, for example, was extraordinary. The way he used orchestration. But he was an incredible improviser. So I think for somebody like myself, I mean, I'm not Wayne Shorter by any means, but there is this contradiction, you might say, in what I do, in the sense that I work as an improviser when nothing is pre-planned. And then I work at home composing in the computer, where I'm combining many different sounds, instruments. I'm working in very precise detail on elements, small elements within a track until I feel it's right, until it's finished. And I think it used to be felt that these two approaches were contradictory. And I don't really think that's the case anymore. You know, I feel that we're at a stage now when, you know, you can work in any of these fields, and what it adds up to is your personal practice. You know, I mean, it used to be felt that you couldn't be a writer and a musician. That if you were a writer, you were a failed musician. And if you were a musician, you were probably a bit stupid. You know, that's what people used to say. And so if you were a writer, a serious writer, and you were a serious musician, then there must be something wrong with you.
So you're just saying that you were a failed, stupid musician.
That's right. Yeah. People actually used to say to me, and actually they still do say to me, that they thought there were two people. There was a David Toop who was a writer, and there was a David Toop who was a musician. Somebody said that to me a couple of weeks ago. And it's quite weird. But anyway, going back to Wayne Shorter, I think there's a lot of truth in that. And, you know, there's a deep relationship between the notion of composing and the practice of improvisation. And, you know, the fact that they've been separated out and made into a kind of marriage that has broken down, or, you know, a hostile relationship is very much to do with the trajectory of European music history, I would say.
But you've done that to a certain degrees in various fashions. Like, I was thinking about, it's a record I really liked back then that now it's very much a product of its time. You work with John Ty.
Yeah.
You did many tracks for his label on these great compilations on low recordings. This is him under Twisted Science, where he's making a sort of very noisy techno. And there's a track on this where you play the guitar.
Is there? That's interesting. Yeah. No, I did work with Twisted Science, and I did work with John for a while. And yeah, you're right. It was this very interesting period of the mid-90s when suddenly everything was much more open-minded. So you would go to an event and there would be ambient music. There was somebody playing Indian tablas, you know, maybe Talvin Singh. There would be, you know, records of industrial music and some improvisation and so on and so on and so on. And it felt like a really healthy breakthrough. And that's in a way the scene that Ocean of Sound came out from. But I actually made techno records in about 1988 because I went to New York to do a story in '87. I can't remember who the story was about. Somebody like Jelly Bean, I think. And I got off the plane and I went straight to a record shop, and there was a DJ there in the shop, and he was playing a Detroit techno record, More UFOs.
Juan Atkins.
Yeah, Juan Atkins. And I rushed up to the DJ and said, "What is this record?" And he told me, and I bought a copy and I took it home, and I realized there was this amazing music coming out of Detroit, which was very experimental. And then Acid Tracks came out, which was also incredibly experimental, from Chicago. And
Sure.
I wrote a lot about that whole scene, and I went to New York and interviewed a lot of people, and started making techno records myself. I just couldn't get them released.
Interesting. We'll have to talk more about that, because I guess that gave you an understanding of all of this, which made you very good content to write liner notes for really important records like that.
You're throwing them at me now. Yes, indeed. Artificial intelligence, and there was a big social media conversation around this series quite recently that I read with great interest. But yes, I guess I was one of the go-to people at that time. I was writing, for example, for Mixmag, which was one of the magazines for dance music at the time, and I was writing for The Face and publications which covered those scenes. So it was natural, I guess, that I would be asked to write liner notes for that kind of record, the emerging techno. And I interviewed people like Aphex Twin very early on in their career. I interviewed Aphex Twin when he was still a student, for example. And many of the people involved in that techno scene I interviewed.
There's another figure that is quite, not directly techno, but is very peripheral, if not more than that, in my opinion is, in his own way, a David Toop for the 90s and further on, because of his versatility, his writing, his curating, and someone which you connected with quite more than a few times, which is the curator of this compilation that was very influential as well.
Yeah.
Kevin Martin.
It's Kevin, yeah. Yeah, well, I had a social connection with Kevin at that time. He was a friend of a friend. That's how I met him. And Kevin did this. He did 2 compilations, I think, for Virgin.
For Virgin, he did this, which is isolation, versions in ambient, and then he did macro dub infection, which was more than dub, but still.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, it was just an incredibly open time, and there were the opportunities to do things because of people being in the right place. So Simon Hopkins was working at Virgin Records. I remember going to him when Ocean of Sound was due to come out, and I said, the publisher wants me to try and put out a compilation album, and I don't know where to go, because it would be such a weird album. And he said, well, we'll do it, i.e. Virgin Records will do it. And that was incredible, and then I did a series of compilations for Virgin Records, with names like Crooning on Venus and Guitars on Mars and Booming on Pluto, and each one a different sort of style. There was one on Soul Batters, there was one on techno, electro techno, one on weird guitar music. And, to be given the opportunity to do that at that time was fantastic. And I think, that Ocean of Sound compilation was nominated, I think, as one of the best 5 compilations of the year. And I think, it had Pauline Oliveros on it, had Peter Brutzmann on it, it had AMM, Music Improvisation Company with Derek Bailey and Evan Parker, Hugh Davison. I think, this is what I always wanted, because I never wanted to remain completely obscure in the shadows. I always wanted to, I suppose, communicate my love and enthusiasm for all of these different musics to other people.
It's interesting because, like, in a way, your background with the obscure music and the maybe rejections made you a perfect vessel for identifying what could be relevant, in my opinion. Relevant, I know it can be a loaded word, but like these compilations, the one that you for Ocean of Sound, and just the collaborators on the CD of yours that I showed earlier, Talvin Singh, John Hassel, Daniel Pemberton, who became one of a great
Yes, Daniel.
Yeah.
I knew Daniel when he was at school. I met him at an ambient party, a kind of house party, like a squat party. And this very young guy came up to me, very bright and confident, and introduced himself to me. And we started working together. We actually played together in Berlin, and we recorded together. And then he became this super famous TV theme and movie soundtrack producer, composer.
Yes.
So I haven't seen him for years, but he's, like I say, he was at school when I started working with him.
I'm almost done, but like I wanted to also one aspect we barely talked about, what you do.
Painting.
Yeah.
That's amazing that you've got that one. Fantastic.
Yeah, he works with us. He's a good friend.
Oh, good. Yeah. The reason that came about was, I trained as an artist. I was.
This is Bobby Vorton from the Field Mices. His new project, or his current project, Lightning in the Twilight Hour.
With my painting as the front cover. Yeah. I've been painting again for the last 4 or 5 years, and during the COVID lockdown, obviously all our lives changed dramatically, and I was doing a lot of work actually because I was getting a lot of writing work during the lockdown, but of course I wasn't going out and meeting people or anything except for my close family, and I was doing a lot of painting, and I posted some things on social media. And Beth Arzi, who's
her partner, his partner.
Yeah, his partner, but she's a great singer, and we'd actually worked with Beth. We did a gig with recreating a group called the 49 Americans, and Beth sang on some of the tracks. So and she was often coming to gigs that I played, and she saw the paintings I had posted on social media and said that she wanted something as a surprise for Bobby, to be used on an album. So, she chose the one she wanted, and it appeared on a record cover, and I felt very proud that it did. Actually, I was really happy. That's a nice record too.
Very nice cover. Very.
For sure is. Yes.
Mm.
And last thing I wanted quickly to tackle, because I suspected something, and you confirmed it, talking about fiction, writing, and knowing you being a Londoner. For me, like the core of the music you've done that I enjoy personally, I have this saying about it, that it's the kind of music that would exist in places even if no one was there to listen to them. It's music that is there anyways, and your music makes me think often a lot about this, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
Which is a way of approaching writing that I think is doing fiction and documentary, which is, in a way, some of what you're doing in your music, in my opinion.
Yes, I think also in my writing, I've experimented quite a lot with writing about music in a fictional way. And the book I did called Exotica experimented with that a lot. But also, if people ask me to write sleeve notes for their records these days, which they do, I mean, I've there's this one from Japan, and this one, a group called In Situ Ends, which is a group of improvisers from various places. Both of them asked me to write sleeve notes, and I always say the same thing. I write in a more poetic way. I'm not interested in writing a sleeve note which says this person plays a great, solo in the second track or whatever. That doesn't interest me at all. And so those are, in a way, a kind of fictional or poetic texts, I would say. So yes, I'm familiar with Ian Sinclair. I'm not a huge fan of his writing, I have to say, but I know his writing. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Gentlemen, 2 hours.
2 hours.
Yeah.
Amazing.
How many questions did we answer?
Quite some, I hope, and quite some, I guess. And you really took us on an amazing journey, David. That was really impressive. And yeah, after this stream, Stunty does his Stunty Friday night live stream. I will join there and we recap what we've heard, what we've learned, and
we listen to some of these records.
and we will listen to some of these records, exactly, because that's the beauty of Stunty's stream, that he actually plays those records so that you can listen to it
In a very
David.
manner.
David, yeah, thank you so much for this amazing, interesting things you've told us. Learned so much. I'm quite impressed.
Well, I have to say, Michael, I'm very grateful to you for this opportunity, and to both of you for helping this to become a really good conversation, because the story is complicated, and it begins in almost complete obscurity in a way. So it needs amplification. It needs kind of unpicking, pulling apart to really understand what was going on. And this, in a way, is the perfect medium, and I've been glancing from time to time, at the live comments here, and some of them are so nice and very heartwarming, really, that people are being so positive and supportive. So it's a fantastic opportunity just to say a bit more about this just amazing box set, which is so important to me, and important to all the people in it, alive or dead.
And David, I think you cannot expect to make so, how can I put it, avant-garde-ish, out there, new music in its time. Of course, it has to be complicated, right?
Completely. Yeah. We're still learning about things that happened a long time ago.
Yeah,
and
we will try to give more context to that. So for that music that is, in essence, there's no easy entry door to that, but like maybe by showing the wide of it all and how connected everything is, or attempting at least to show that it would give an easier entry door to that wonderful project.
Yeah, I hope so. because people have complicated lives now, and
Hasn't it
there's
been
a lot of
complicated
expectation.
too? In the 70s, was it all easy? I guess not. Is it
Nothing was easy. Nothing was easy there. Nothing was easy. But the difference, I would say, is that in the 70s, you understood that you had to really work at things to learn them, because very little was given to you. I mean, you could go to the public library and maybe find the book you were looking for, or maybe not. But everything else, all of the research and everything was very, very hard. And that's simpler now, but that makes complications in itself. So, sometimes I think people are maybe intimidated, or, they don't have the energy to approach something like this, which is complex. So hopefully, we've given a bit more. We've hopefully made the entry point a bit easier.
I think what you did today for a lot of people, and for me too, and this is very important when it comes to this kind of music, you gave a lot of context. And that really helps to get into it and understand it more, understand it deeply. And it needs to be deeper, and you need to have an understanding of what you are experiencing right now. And I think what you have said and shared today was very helpful in that regard. I'm quite sure.
I hope so. I've been asked to write a short text for the Obscure Records box set, and I'm just thinking about that, and thinking about how all of that music emerged in the 1970s, where there was so much conflict and turmoil, and so many amazing new ideas coming up, and the growth of feminism, for example, and the politics was very extreme at that time. Labor relations in this country were extremely polarized. There was a tremendous amount of protests. There were religious cults coming up, extreme politics, which were directly affecting the music. If you think of Cornelius Cardew and Keith Rowe, becoming Marxist-Leninist, then Maoist, and splitting up the whole of that scene apart with their politics. All of that stuff is very, very relevant, but in a way, we're only beginning to understand it now. You always need time to be able to reflect. Yeah, it takes time. So hopefully we've done that, and I'm very grateful to you.
At least we tried our best.
We tried our best. Yes.
Thank you so much. I hope this wasn't the last time that you.
I hope not. Thank you both.
And do something again together.
And this, until our overloads decides otherwise, this video is forever.
Yes. Thank you.